The morning was stitched with quiet frost, and the sky wore the color of unspoken things, soft gray, stretching over a world that felt paused. Jack stood at the edge of a gravel road, steam rising from the coffee he could barely afford and barely tasted. Across the way, a rusted red truck waited beneath a sagging pine, half buried in last week's snow and time. Its paint had faded to something between memory and rust, and yet it called to him, as if it remembered a life he didn't. He adjusted his worn flannel collar against the cold and glanced at the little boy beside him. Luke's mittened hand was inside his own, small and trusting. Jack squeezed it gently. "Think it runs?" Luke asked, his voice muffled beneath layers of wool. Jack squinted through the flurry dancing in the air. "We're about to find out." He hesitated at the farmhouse gate. It was one of those old, quiet homes that didn't beg for attention but stood like it had always been there. Peeling white paint, a front porch where a rocking chair hadn't moved in a long while. Jack walked up the path, boots crunching, each step reluctant and drawn from some deeper place inside him. The door opened before he could knock. She wasn't what he expected. The widow, Margaret. She wore a gray sweater that matched her hair, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She took him in with a gaze that didn't flinch, and then softened when she saw Luke. "You're here for the truck," she said, not asked. Jack nodded, saw the sign. "Hasn't moved in a while, but it's got a heart." She stepped back. "You'll want to see it for yourself." The truck's keys were inside. Sitting in the ignition, like waiting, hadn't been hard at all. Jack opened the door, expecting resistance, but the hinges moaned obediently. Luke climbed up behind him, eyes wide. The engine coughed on the first turn, then again, a third time, and then it came alive. Not smoothly, not easily, but with a kind of reluctant resilience Jack could respect. He sat in the driver's seat, feeling the tremble in the wheel, the way the whole thing shook but held. He turned it off after a moment. The quiet returned like breath settling. Margaret was watching from the porch. Jack got out and walked toward her. "What's the story?" he asked. "Belonged to my husband," she said. Her hands were in her pockets, fingers likely curled tight. "Against the cold. He died some time back, couldn't bring myself to sell it. Until now." Jack didn't press further. Some things didn't need explaining. He simply nodded. "I don't have much," he said, honest and steady. "But I can pay some today, the rest by month's end." Margaret's gaze lingered on him, then fell to Luke, who was now tracing the frosted edge of the windshield with one gloved finger. "I'm not worried about the money," she said. "You look like someone who needs something that won't quit on you." Jack blinked. He hadn't expected kindness, not lately. He extended his hand. "Jack," he said. She took it. "Margaret." The deal was made, just like that. No papers. No signatures. Only snowflakes between them. She invited them inside while she found the title. Her house smelled like cedar and lemon polish, a kind of warmth that seeped in through the skin and reminded you of good things. Photographs lined a narrow hallway. Wedding days, birthdays, quiet smiles frozen in black and white. Jack lingered. At one of them. A man in uniform standing next to the red truck when it still looked proud and new. "That him?" he asked. Margaret nodded from the other room. "Tom. Always came back in one piece somehow, even when he didn't." She handed him a folder, neat and old. The paper inside had yellowed slightly, like everything here, touched by time but kept safe. Luke sat on a stool in the kitchen, swinging his feet and holding a cookie Margaret had, offered with a quiet nod. They didn't stay long. The snow was thickening, and Jack didn't like to keep Luke out too long in weather like this. When they stepped back outside, the cold slapped his cheeks again. He thanked her with a quiet sincerity, and she just nodded, like she didn't expect anything more. He started the truck again. This time it growled more confidently. As he buckled Luke in, he glanced at the glove box. He opened it absently, finding nothing but a single matchbook from a long-closed diner and a small folded napkin. No note, no artifact of the man who'd once driven it across years. Jack closed it gently, They drove through the snow-draped streets of their small town, the heater wheezing faint warmth. Jack's fingers tightened around the wheel, the hum of the engine syncing with his heartbeat. This truck, this gift, felt like something more than luck. It felt like a turning. "You like it?" he asked Luke. Luke nodded, eyes glued to the snowy blur outside. "Can we name it?" Jack chuckled. "Yeah, maybe we can." They reached home as the last light drained from the sky. Their house, a small rental near the edge of town, stood lonely but upright, windows glowing from a lamp left on in the hallway. Jack parked the truck beside the sagging fence and lifted Luke out. The boy leaned his head against Jack's shoulder on the way inside, already half asleep. Jack tucked him into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Then he stood at the doorway for a long time, listening to the soft breath of his son. The only sound in the world that felt like hope. Later, with the house silent and the wind brushing against the window panes like forgotten fingers, Jack sat alone at the table. The folder Margaret had given him lay open. He studied the title transfer, the small signature, Thomas J. Whitaker. The name scratched at something inside his chest. Not memory exactly, but something close, like hearing a note from a song you once knew. He closed the folder, set it aside, and rubbed his eyes. The next morning, as sunlight spilled pale across the porch, Jack stepped outside with his coffee. The truck glinted faintly beneath the frost, its red returning in slow tones. He walked up to it and opened the door again. The seat was stiff but intact. A small brass plate was bolted above the glove box. He hadn't noticed it before. Engraved, worn with time. "For Margaret, always come back." Jack stared at it, the words sinking past his ribs. "Always come back." He reached out, ran a finger across the letters, then let his hand fall. The engine turned once, then twice before settling into a low purr. He pulled out of the driveway, the road stretching empty ahead of him. In the passenger seat sat his tool belt. On the dash, a paper coffee cup. And under his breath he whispered, "All right, old man, let's get to work." The story hadn't begun in that truck, nor had it ended. But as the town passed by in soft focused silence, Jack knew something was waking, something steady, old, and kind, and it had wheels. The sky held its breath that morning. An overcast hush stretched across the town, as if the world was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. Jack drove the old red truck past the frost-bitten fields and sleeping storefronts, the muffled hum of the engine filling the quiet like an old song humming through the chest. Something about the way it moved now, steady, dependable, reminded him of the first good handshake after a long season of bad ones. He was headed to the lumber yard. He had a job, small piecemeal work rebuilding a collapsed back porch on the edge of town. Nothing glamorous, but it paid, and more importantly, it kept his hands moving. Jack didn't do well with stillness. Not anymore. At a stoplight, he reached out without thinking and touched the brass plate on the glove box again. For Margaret, always come back. It wasn't just sentiment. It was a whisper from one man to another. Something about that name, that truck, the kindness of the widow. It pulled at Jack with threads he couldn't name. Luke was at school now, the first full week he'd gone without needing Jack to linger by the doors, just in case. The boy was growing brave, bit by bit, like he was learning the shape of safety again. Jack had started packing his lunch with little notes. Nothing dramatic, just a crooked smiley face or "you got this" scribbled in dull pencil. Luke kept them all. By the time he reached the job site, the sky had brightened, and the clouds had begun to drift apart, revealing a blue that felt like a slow apology. The homeowner was an older man named Earl. Gruff voice, smoker's laugh, and a limp that told of hard labor and harder winters. "Didn't think you'd show up with a beauty like that," Earl grinned, nodding toward the truck. "Looks like it remembers better roads." Jack gave a soft smile. "Still runs strong." "She's got stories," Earl chuckled. "Ain't that the truth about old things?" The work was good. Simple, quiet, and rhythmic. Jack measured twice, sawed once, and let his mind rest in the weight of wood and nail. There was peace in honest work, in the clean cut of a board, and the way something broken could become whole again under your hands. By midday, he paused to eat on the truck's tailgate. He sat with the sandwich Margaret had tucked into a brown bag that morning. She'd waved him down as he passed her house, handed it over with a brief nod and a look that said, "Don't argue." Jack didn't. He just said thank you. And she went. Back inside before the words even cooled in the air. The sandwich was turkey, light mustard, and something that tasted like rosemary. Jack hadn't eaten that well in weeks. He chewed slowly, the cold air wrapping around his shoulders, and he watched a hawk circle above the woods. He thought about Margaret. Since buying the truck, he'd seen her twice more. Once when he stopped by to return a borrowed wrench. Once when she was pruning the frost-wilted garden behind the house. Each time she greeted him with a quiet grace, never pushing for conversation, never holding him too long. But something had settled between them. A shared silence. An understanding. Later that week, when Jack picked up Luke from school, the boy was buzzing with something he hadn't seen in months. "Guess what?" Luke said, climbing into the truck, cheeks pink from the cold. "We're doing a family project. Gotta bring in something from home that means a lot." Jack felt the pang before he could hide it. Family. The word felt like a sweater too small. He gave a sideways smile. "Got anything in mind?" Luke thought for a second. "Can I bring the matchbook from the glove box? The one with the diner name?" Jack blinked. "You sure?" "Yeah, I like how it's small, but it still meant something." "To somebody, right?" Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, bud, it did." They stopped by Margaret's again that evening. Jack brought over a few cut logs, firewood he owed her for helping him borrow a dolly from her shed. It wasn't much, but it felt good to give something back. She opened the door before he could knock. "You always pause like that," she said gently. "Like what?" "Like you're asking the house for permission." Jack laughed under his breath. "Maybe I am." She led him to the living room this time. It was filled with books in low light, the air carrying the scent of pine and something sweet. Maybe cinnamon. A fire cracked softly in the hearth. He placed the wood near it and straightened up. Luke wandered toward the photographs again, as he always did. Jack let him. Margaret didn't seem to mind. There was a moment where neither adult spoke. The fire popped. Outside, the wind brushed against the window panes. Margaret finally broke the silence. "You said you served." "Which branch?" Jack turned, slow. He hadn't told her. Not really. But some people could see the way years settled in your shoulders. "Army," he said. "Afghanistan." She nodded once. Tom was Navy, Pacific, then Europe. Always said war makes strangers into brothers. Jack looked down at his hands. "I lost a few." She didn't ask for names, didn't ask for stories. She just offered a cup of tea. They sat in that low firelight, the three of them, Jack, Luke, and Margaret, while the house hummed gently around them. It felt less like visiting someone and more like returning to something you'd forgotten you were part of. On their way out, Margaret handed Jack a small envelope. "He wrote this for someone," she said. "Tom, never sent it." "I don't know who it's for, but you should have it. Maybe it's yours to carry now." Jack looked at the handwriting, looped steady. He slipped it into his coat pocket without opening it. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "That truck came to you for a reason." At home that night after Luke fell asleep, Jack sat at the kitchen table. The old envelope rested in front of him, yellowed at the corners. No name on the outside, just a date, 1967. He opened it. Inside, a letter written in blue ink. No introduction. No farewell, just a single paragraph. "If you're reading this, I never got to thank you. For pulling me from the wreck. For saying nothing when you could have said everything. For the silence, the nod, the cigarette passed between dirt-caked fingers. I lived a whole life after that. Married, loved, made things grow. I came back because of you. I hope you did too." Jack stared at it for a long time. His hands were shaking, barely. The ink was smudged in one place as if time had wept into it. Something unlatched in his chest. He remembered a face, not the name, but the moment. A field, smoke, blood, the weight of another man's arm slung across his shoulders, the burn of a match, the silence. He remembered saving someone. He never knew who until now, and now he owned that man's truck. Now he sat in the warmth of his widow's home. Now his son wandered that same hallway of photos, piecing together echoes from before he was born. Jack folded the letter and slipped it into the glove box, not to forget it, but to carry it. The snow began again that night, soft and slow, as if the sky was blanketing the world with forgiveness. Jack watched it fall from the porch, one hand on the brass plate inside the truck, the other resting against his heart. He whispered the man's name aloud once, just to say it. Tom, and the wind carried it like a prayer answered too late but not too lost. The engine would turn again tomorrow, and so would Jack. The truck's engine murmured to life under a steel-gray morning, its exhaust curling like breath into the cold air. Jack sat behind the wheel longer than necessary, letting the heater warm the cab, but also letting something quieter settle inside him. Since he read the letter, a subtle shift had taken hold. The world hadn't changed, but the way he looked at it had, like he'd finally been given the missing line in a story that had haunted him for years. He reached over and touched the glove box, the brass plate cool under his fingertips. For Margaret, always come back. The metal no longer felt like a mystery, it felt like a promise. One man to another, one who came home, one who made sure someone else could too. Luke climbed into the truck beside him, tugging his knit cap down over his ears. "Are we going to the bookstore after?" Jack nodded, as promised. "If you find your chapter book, I'll find a good coffee." Luke grinned. Deal. The plan was to spend the weekend quietly, just the two of them. But fate, it seemed, had other ideas. Halfway through the drive, Jack spotted Margaret at the edge of town, parked on the shoulder, bent over the back tire of her station wagon. The hazard lights blinked like a heartbeat. "Mom's stuck," Luke said before Jack even slowed. "She's not your mom," Jack reminded gently, though he didn't sound convinced. Luke shrugged. "Feels like she could be." Jack pulled over, behind her, and cut the engine. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached. Margaret straightened slowly, brushing her hands on her coat. "Flat," she said. "And of course I left the jacket home." Jack crouched beside the tire. "Let me." He worked in silence, the cold nipping at his knuckles. Margaret didn't hover. She stepped back, arms folded, watching the road instead of him. When he finally finished and tightened the last lug nut, he stood up and blew into his hands. "You didn't have to stop," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. Her eyes were tired but open. Honest. There was something beautiful in how unguarded she was with him. They stood close, wind slipping between them like a secret not yet told. "Can I ask you something?" Jack finally said. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Of course." "Why me?" She blinked. "You'll have to be more specific." "The truck, the letter, the lunches, all of it. You didn't know me. Why trust me with any of it?" Her breath clouded in the air. She took a step forward. "Because when you looked at it," she said, nodding toward the truck, "you looked like you'd lost something. And when you spoke to me, you sounded like someone who wanted to start again." That was enough. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The words sat too heavy in his throat. Later, in the warmth of the bookstore cafe, Luke was lost among the shelves while Jack stared out the window. His coffee steamed untouched beside him. Margaret sat across from him, flipping slowly through a book of old poetry. "The kind with faded paper and cracked spines. You're not wearing your wedding ring anymore," Jack said softly. Margaret looked up, neither startled nor defensive. "I took it off last year. Just hadn't figured out where to put it yet." "You loved him a lot." "I still do," she said without hesitation. "But that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to miss other things too. Connection, companionship. Someone who stays for coffee because they want to." Jack studied her hand resting on the table, pale, steady, honest. A hand that had given without asking in return. He reached out and touched it just briefly, enough to say he understood, enough to say he might want that too. That evening, Luke and Jack found themselves back at Margaret's house. She'd invited them for dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup. And bread and a fire lit before dusk. Luke took to it instantly, curling up in the armchair by the fire with his new book. Margaret cooked with the kind of grace that came from practice. She moved through her kitchen like she was telling a story. With her hands, Jack helped where he could, chopping carrots, setting plates, trying not to let the moment slip through his fingers. During dinner, Luke asked questions about the war, about Tom, about the photograph of him in uniform. Margaret answered each, one with careful honesty, never glamorizing, never shying away. Just the truth, wrapped in warmth. After dinner, she brought out a small wooden box. "I wasn't sure who to give this to," she said, eyes on Jack. "But I think it's meant for you." He opened it slowly. Inside were a few keepsakes, a compass, a pocket knife, a black and white photo of two men in muddy fatigues. One of them, unmistakably Tom, and a medal. Jack's breath caught. "This?" he said. Margaret nodded. "He never told me much. Just that one man made it possible for him to come home. I think he hoped to find him again someday. Maybe now, in some way, he has." Jack closed the lid. He couldn't speak. That night, after Luke had fallen asleep on the couch and Jack was getting ready to leave, Margaret walked him to the door. Snow drifted gently across the porch. The world, quiet and soft. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For being someone who shows up even when it's hard, even when you don't have to." Jack looked at her. Really looked. "You make it easy," he said. She smiled, small but real. As he stepped outside, the snow caught in his hair. He turned back, one hand on the doorframe. "Would you want to do this again? Dinner, I mean. Just being together." Margaret met his gaze. "Yes, I would." Jack nodded once, a weight lifting from his shoulders. In the truck, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. Luke stirred beside him, still half asleep. "Did we stay too long?" the boy mumbled. Jack smiled. "Nobody, I think we stayed just long enough." The road home was lined in white, trees like skeletons stretching across the sky. The headlights cut a path through the quiet, and Jack felt for the first time in a long time like he was moving towards something, not away. The brass plate glinted, in the dark, and for the first time since the war, Jack whispered to the night, not in prayer, not in pain, but in hope. "I'm coming back," the wind answered, soft and sure, and the truck rumbled on into the snow. The spring thaw arrived like a memory returning from sleep. Slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. Snowbanks melted into rivulets that streamed past curbs and soaked into thawing earth. The old truck, still running with Tom's quiet blessing, etched in brass, now bore a new sheen under the warming sun. Jack washed it every Sunday morning with Luke, not out of vanity but reverence, like cleaning a monument. Life hadn't transformed overnight. Jack still worked overtime when he could, still packed lunches with more care than flair, and still held his breath during every parent-teacher conference. But something had shifted between the lines, the kind of change that didn't shout but hummed, constant and true. Margaret had become a fixture. Not all at once, not with declarations or promises, but with presence. She joined them on grocery trips, invited them to church, and brought over stew in mason jars. Jack, in return, fixed her leaky faucet, mowed her yard, and once rewired her. Porch light, more out of desire to be near than any real sense of obligation. They didn't call what they were anything. That would have broken the spell. Instead, they existed inside a fragile mutual unfolding, an echo of something long lost, now becoming new. One Saturday, as clouds bruised the horizon and the air thickened with the scent of wet soil, Jack and Margaret drove out to the cemetery. Luke stayed with neighbors. It was Margaret's idea, but Jack hadn't resisted. He brought the wooden box with him. They stood in silence before the headstone. Thomas Avery, beloved husband, loyal soldier. 1945-2009. The ground was soft beneath their feet, the trees still leafless, but alive with bird calls. Margaret laid fresh lilies down. Jack knelt and placed the box gently on the headstone's base. "I should have been there that night," Jack whispered. "The night he swallowed. He saved me. I've spent years trying to forget the sound of mortar fire, but I never forgot his voice. He told me to run, so I did." Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Her hand found his shoulder. He would have done it again. That's who he was. Jack stood slowly, facing her. "I didn't just owe him my life. I owed him a better one than I was living." Margaret shook her head. "You don't owe anyone, but you are living better. He'd be proud." They drove back in silence, their hands brushing now and then on the bench seat. The wind picked up. Thunder cracked once, far off, like the past giving one final sigh before letting go. Later that week, the truck sputtered to a stop on the side of a winding country road just after dusk. Jack opened the hood and frowned. Steam hissed. Something had snapped. Margaret stood beside him, her flashlight casting long shadows over the engine. "Looks like the belt," Jack muttered. Margaret crossed her arms. "You can fix it?" "Eventually." He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But we're walking tonight." Margaret smiled, unbothered. "Good thing I wore boots." They started down the road, night falling around them in gentle layers. The moon emerged shyly behind wisps of cloud. Their steps were quiet, side by side, their breath forming little ghosts in the cooling air. "I used to be afraid of silence," Margaret said suddenly. "Felt like it would swallow me after Tom died. I'd turn on the radio just to hear a voice." Jack glanced at her. "And now?" "Now I think silence is where the real stuff lives." Jack didn't respond, but a moment later his hand found hers, their fingers laced naturally, like they'd been doing it all along. The next day, they returned with a new belt. Jack installed it in the driveway while Luke watched, asking questions about tools and timing. Margaret brought lemonade. The truck roared back to life with a cough and a growl. "You know," Jack said, wiping sweat from his brow, "I never thought something so old could still run this good." Margaret looked up at him, eyes warm. "You're not just talking about the truck, are you?" Jack laughed. "Maybe not." One afternoon, while Margaret was out visiting her sister in the next county, Jack found himself in her garage, looking for a rake. What he found instead was a locked cabinet in the far corner, not out of place, but curious. The key, rusted brass, was hanging on a nail nearby. He didn't open it to snoop. He opened it because something about it called to him. Inside were stacks of letters carefully bundled, all addressed to M. Avery. Return address, Camp Hartwell, North Carolina. Jack recognized the name immediately. It was where Tom had trained before deployment, and then another bundle, smaller, more recent. The top envelope read simply, "To be opened if he finds his way home." Jack sat on a wooden stool, the sun pouring in from the window, and opened the letter with trembling hands. "Dear Jack, if you're reading this, it means Margaret trusted you with something I never got to say in person. You were just a kid when I saw you fall behind that ridge. I didn't think, I just went. I didn't expect to make it back, but I hoped you would. I watched you run. I watched you live. And that was enough. But if you found Margaret, and she's let you in, then maybe fate still writes letters of its own. Take care of her, and let her take care of you. You both deserve a little peace." Tom Jack pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. A breeze stirred through the open window, gentle as breath. He put the letter back in its envelope and closed the cabinet with care. He didn't tell Margaret he'd read it. Not that day. Some words weren't meant to be passed around like news. Some words needed to settle like dust before they could be spoken aloud. The last Sunday of the month arrived with a festival downtown. Flags strung between lampposts, food carts lining the square. Jack and Luke walked hand in hand through the crowd. Margaret caught up with them after helping her church set up a pie stand. She wore a blue scarf that fluttered like a bird in the wind. They stood together near the bandstand, music wafting into the early evening. Jack put his arm around her without thinking. She leaned in. Luke, finishing his popcorn, simply grinned. "You know," Jack said softly, "I don't know if I believe in fate." Margaret smiled. "That's all right. I believe enough for both of us." They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. As the sun dipped behind the courthouse steeple, casting everything in gold and hush, Jack turned to her. "Margaret." She looked up. "I think I'm ready." "For what?" "To stop running." She touched his cheek. "Then stay." He did. That night, as Luke slept soundly in his bed and the truck rested warm in the driveway, Jack sat at the kitchen table with Margaret. A candle flickered between them. Outside, crickets sang low lullabies. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out the medal from the wooden box. He placed it in her palm. "This doesn't belong to me," he said. Margaret stared at. "Quiet." Jack leaned forward. "But I'd like to earn it every day if you'll let me." She nodded, tears brimming. Outside, the night thickened around their little world, but inside, a flame had been lit, and it would not go out. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.